Well, hello friends. It is an overcast day. It is early spring still, and that means it's a perfect time to be in the garden and planting some very large trees. So today I'm planting some really big bald and burlap trees. You've seen me do this before, but I always think it's interesting to see the different ways we can plant trees, but also the different ways they come. Now, I am gonna be out by the road today slightly. I'm in the field, kind of where I've planted a prairie grass mixture of wildflowers. And so it's somewhat close to the road, so if you hear road noise, that's why. But it does have a windbreak today behind me with this big evergreen, big wind row kind of behind me. So you can see the crab apples are still blooming. It's really been an odd spring in the sense that it started really early. We had a really early warm up in February, April, March, all those have been extra warm. So garden work seems to be way ahead where it should be, but it's still a great time to plant trees. The reason I'm planting them now, I like to get them in the spring, especially when it comes to evergreens like spruce. So I'm planting 3 Black Hill spruce, and I'm gonna show you how big they are. So my front driveway is right up there. So this is really what I'm doing, is starting to hedge the future for when I know the arborvitae windrow behind me is gonna kind of start going. It's kind of getting past its prime. There's becoming a lot of dead areas in it that are falling out during heavy storms, winters, things like that. This was planted, I think, this big row of arborvitae in the 60s, in the 1960s. So what I'm trying to do is start planting things on the other side of it. So someday if some of these start coming down or need to come down, I will have some things planted. And that's what 3 of these big Black Hill spruce are gonna do. They're gonna be the corner out here into my prairie. Now, native grasses, wildflowers, they come up much later, but you can see they're starting to fill in from last year. There's some flowers that are even coming, like black-eyed Susans. So what I'm doing is I just picked these up yesterday, these big bald burlap trees. Now these were kind of halfway in the ground, so a lot of the burlap here is coming off, which is just fine. I will be taking off the metal ring when I have the hole dug and go to plant them in. They were burrowed just slightly in the hole, kind of bermed in, and you can see they were starting to push out some new roots. That means they're super healthy. What I look for when I am looking at new trees like this is the health of them, how they look. Do they have a lot of dry areas? Are they nice and kind of the good green color? And do they have fresh eyes on them? And I'm gonna show you what I mean by fresh eyes if you don't know. This one's slightly laying over. See all these at the end of the branches? All these are new buds for where it's gonna grow out, tons of new growth. So if I see these on a tree, especially an evergreen, in the spring, this is what happens in the spring, I know it's a healthy tree that has a lot of growth potential in it. So here in another month, these will all push out into new growth and you won't see them. But this time of year, I love to see these. First thing you wanna do when you're planting a new tree, whether it's big ones like this, no matter what, is know where your locates are. This is out in a field and I know where my locates are. If I was planting this, and I don't live around a lot of utilities since I'm out in a rural area, but if you're have any questions, you should always call your locates. And that means they're gonna come out and mark where your lines are. If a landscape company would come, they're gonna ask you to do the same thing, because you don't wanna dig without knowing where lines are. You don't wanna hit lines, both, whether it's internet, whether it's gas, obviously, electric, anything, you wanna know where those locates are. So I'm safe on that, and then what I did was just quickly measured out how I want them. So I put 3 of these in last year on another corner, and I did them about 16 foot on center, because someday when they grow, you wanna know their full size, their mature size. I want them to grow into each other slightly so they create a corner that's a barrier both for people seeing, but also for privacy and for wind, depending on what direction it's coming from. So this is all going out into really nice, rich Iowa farmland. But the one thing is, this soil used to be planted with corn or soybeans, so it's very compact in these areas. I'm gonna show you how I'm working against that and how big the holes need to be. If we look at these root balls, obviously we can see they're big. Now this is a fresh one this year, it has the burlap still on it. These 2 were bermed in where I bought them, so the burlap is coming off. But you can see these are big root balls, and yes, 2 times the size is the general rule. This is a lot of work to do by yourself. A lot of landscapers would use a machine to help dig these holes since they're so big. I may not go quite 2 times, but I do want to make sure I go over the width. But the difference here is I'm gonna go over the width, so it's a big hole. I'm not gonna go too much over the depth. I want this tree to be planted fairly high. Whenever you plant a new tree, remember, it will continue to sink a little bit on its own just from the displaced soil. And oftentimes on these, you can't see that root flare too well because some of this soil is furrowed up around there. And I want to give it plenty of height so it doesn't suffocate if planted too deep. Got my helper. When I'm starting to dig a hole, and this is gonna seem elementary for some, and that's fine, but let's remember, not everyone has always planted a tree. I'm starting in an area that has not been planted in like the yard has been. So I like to start, I have my spot marked, you can see I just started digging, and I start going around the perimeter and keep taking more soil out. When we get to the close to the size, you're gonna wanna know how big you need to go, but also if you're working in a grassy area, like a nice mown yard, put a tarp down and lay that soil on there. Out here, I don't care where the soil goes. What you're gonna notice is when I have the perimeter somewhat dug, it's pushing a lot of loose soil into the center. So usually what I do is keep making my ring as big as I want, and then I go in and start scooping out from the center. Now, I can tell, like I said, the soil is really compacted. So when they do farming on fields, there's big equipment, heavy equipment, and this had years probably, even though they do sometimes rip it or try to open the soil up, compared to my yard where I plant, which is loamy, really easy to work with, this is still nice black, rich soil, but see how it's coming out in clods and clumps that are much bigger? I'll bring them up to you and you can kind of see how these look almost compacted together. That's what I'm really going to try to help enrich the soil, help it have better drainage, help it be a little bit better around this tree so as it grows, has a better, just a better time getting its roots into that soil. When I get close to starting to wonder if my planting depth, this is gonna be kind of in depth here, but when I wanna know if my planting depth is good and I don't have a tape measure with me, I will use my shovel as a guide. I'll stick it beside to know the height. And I'll bring it over here. I'll stick it down so I can check. So right now, we'd be sitting at about 6 inches proud. So this would stick out around 6 inches. Now, I'm gonna let it stick out at least 4 inches. So I'm getting really close because I want this to be set pretty high for where it's at currently. It's gonna be much healthier for the tree overall. So what I'm gonna do is probably get a scoop shovel now so I can scoop out some of the bottom a little bit better. It'll just be easier to remove that soil that way. So my hole is pretty much dug, but now let's talk about what I'm gonna do to make sure that hole is going to be the best for, and the soil around it's gonna be the best for the trees. So I'm gonna use 3 things today. Biotone, I put with anything. It's really a root stimulator that helps those roots become active and wanna grow into that soil. I'm also gonna use that land and sea compost. I've been using this for a few years now and love it. What I love is it's going to enrich the soil, help the soil organically, also help lighten it slightly. Just by adding a great organic matter, it's gonna work with the native soil over time to loosen it. And I could every year now add some of this compost on top just to help the soil all around. I will also be using what may look surprising, but Hollytone, and I'm gonna explain why I'm using Hollytone. So if you look here, Hollytone doesn't usually make sense because there's evergreen tone. I'm out of evergreen tone, but Hollytone happens to be evergreen and azalea food. So another good way to check, I love Espoma products in general because they're organic, they're gonna help the soil, not only the plant. You can always look on things and say, okay, what else is this going to work on? So right here, this says right here, if you look down to E, it says evergreens. So when I'm out of evergreen tone, I'll use another product that works just as well, which Hollytone for evergreens too. So I'll be doing a mixture of all 3 of these in that hole. The compost is gonna act more as obviously enriching the soil, help lightening it slightly, good for drainage. Plant starter, Biotone is gonna really help get those roots wanting to go into the native soil. And Hollytone is just gonna be more of a fertilizer that I'll put on probably for the next few years too. The big thing to remember when you are using a compost or any type of soil amendment, you only want it, to me, I always say only amend up to maybe 50% in total. You want those roots to get acclimated to your native soil. Sometimes if you only do compost, it's too rich, it's too beautiful. Those roots aren't gonna wanna go out into the native soil. So mix it in with your native soil about 50%, and you'll be perfect. So down in here, I already have that compost, which you can see is a beautiful texture. It's nice and fine, it breaks apart easily. And it has it down in here too, some of that biotone. Do you see the biotone that I'm mixing in now? So I do like to mix this in really well. And then I'll add the holly tone that I'm really using as evergreen tone, which is gonna be good for these trees. Now you can see these trees are quite big. So this goes by the size, usually, of that trunk. So what I'm doing is just really mixing all this together well. And that is gonna be, so once I put this tree, since it is so heavy and big, once I put it down here into this area, I am not gonna probably, one, be able to, actually I know I won't be able to, but also don't want to have to pull it back out, because I'm gonna cut off that wire and I'm gonna roll it down into this hole. Once it's there, it's never moving. When I work with a tree like this, I use a large skid loader or the bucket of a skid loader to bring the tree to where I want to plant it. Now I could have that here and try to drop it in the hole. I find it's easier for me usually to maneuver these when I'm close to the hole by rolling them, just so I can control a little bit more the placement and how it's going in there. So since they're so heavy, usually what I do when they're large is I roll them as needed. You have to watch the branching, but then I can somewhat control getting it up close to here before I start, which now what I'll do is start cutting this off. Now, somehow, in the last year, since last spring, I lost my heavy-duty wire cutter, so I'm gonna use a 10 snips. Is it the best? No, but we make do with what we have. So I will go through now, because there's a wire basket encasing this. There are landscapers who don't mind planting these baskets. The roots will go through them, but I don't like that constriction on those roots. I don't like that also in my soil. So I cut the whole thing off, and then we'll roll this tree out of it down into the hole. Once I have that basket somewhat opened up, you can see I'm able to push it open and actually bend it back as needed. Now, like I said, this is an older tree that was actually bermed in over winter locally, so that all that burlap is pretty much negated at this point too. So what I'm gonna do is roll that basket, that wire basket that I cut open underneath, and now I'm just gonna slowly roll this tree, hopefully, into the hole. If I need to, I twist it as I'm doing it. Perfect. So you can see, or maybe you can't see, but let me come over so you can. This is sitting about 4 to 6 inches above that soil grade. And that's what I want. I want this to sit above, because if you plant a tree too deep, I have found it's always gonna be much worse than if you plant it too high. Trees are able to adapt what they need, but they need that mix of oxygen with their roots. So if they're too deep, they suffocate, they encircle their roots, and they start pushing the roots upwards, eventually strangling the tree. So especially on these older trees that are balled and burlapped like this, I plant them rather high for that soil that's furrowed around also. I have a little bit more cleanup to do around this, but we're gonna go ahead and plant the other two. Hope it will speed it up here because it could take me a little bit to dig those holes. And then talk about watering, mulching, maintenance of these, and more importantly, I'm gonna talk about why I like to plant balled and burlap of this size if I can. So I had the tree in there, and guys, I'm gonna be honest, it was supposed to be filming on my last clip, and it wasn't. So I'm gonna tell you what happened. So once I had the tree in there, you're gonna notice that that burlap was still on it. So the only difference between this tree and those other two trees is that those sat over a winter locally, not planted, and they had the burlap over them and they disintegrated. That burlap disintegrated because it's natural burlap over the winter. The wire cage was left. On this one, I obviously removed the wire cage, left that burlap on. That's for a couple of reasons. So this root ball felt a little bit more loose, and it all depends what grower, like what their medium they plant in, what they use, how loose or tight it is, how wet it is too. This one, I wanted to keep the burlap on so that root ball stayed together. The big important thing to me with the ball and burlap, or a lot of trees, is you don't want to separate that root ball, have it break apart and just expose all the roots. That's going to really stress the tree, especially evergreens. So I kept the burlap on, so as I put it in the hole, it would be on. Also notice, it's going to disintegrate in like a year because it's natural burlap. Once I had it in the hole though, I cut out quite a ways down all that burlap and removed it, leaving only that bottom portion because I'm not going to lift the tree up. Now, when you do take it out, remember there's going to be nails in it because that's how they keep the burlap on. So I removed all that around the top and then brought this soil back around it. Now this soil, being almost out of what was a field, was actually much easier to work with. It's much more almost loamy, breaks apart easier, so it was really a nice area to dig. We have a lot of moisture in the ground too right now. So that's why I wanted to keep the burlap on. I'm not worried, it's going to disintegrate here in a year or two, so it'll be just fine. But the wire cage, that's one of the reasons some landscapers leave them on. They want that root ball to stay intact. Personally, it's just something I do to take a little bit more time to remove them. But that's kind of up to each person as they plant them. You can see how heavy they are. If you can, and you want these big trees, it's worth having someone else plant them so you don't have to wear yourself out. Obviously, I'm gonna sleep good tonight. So I'm gonna get a load of mulch so we can finish up and just talk about ongoing care of these. Finishing up now mulching this last tree. Now the important thing to know with mulch is you're gonna first think this looks mounded. It's not. Remember, these trees are set high because they're gonna settle over time because I want that root flare to be exposed. So I'm mulching around the perimeter of it up against, not the trunk, just up against its root ball. Now, what I'm using is just a hardwood mulch. I get it in bulk, and so I scoop it onto the back of a gator so I can bring it around to wherever I need it. Now, the reason I'm doing it here is this is somewhat of a grassy native planting. As you remember, I planted this area last year, and I want this to be delineated so I can always see it, but also to retain any of that moisture. So right now we're sitting really actually pretty good for soil moisture. We're supposed to get a couple good rains. Obviously I'm gonna water these right now. I usually, if I was planting them in a dry condition, I would have made sure to water the hole really well while it was exposed with the tree sitting in it before I filled it back in. I'm not worried about that right now because they're well watered. The soil moisture is good. Now what I will do is make sure to now water them. Since they're such big trees, I'll probably water them around 10 gallon each first sitting. And the reason you do that, you want to water them very well. You want to kind of try to get rid of all those air pockets that are in there, which will take a little bit since some of this soil wasn't, the most fine. But you want to make sure to draw out those air pockets because those air pockets can dry out roots all around that tree. So putting this down is going to help keep any weeds from growing right around the tree. It's also going to retain that moisture like we want to do. And it just helps me be able to quickly see them where I have them in the grass as needed. So someday, obviously in the next while, when they really start to take off and grow, I won't be mulching them year to year. This is really only in the beginning. It's not even for looks out here, it's just to retain that moisture and suppress any weeds. So as you can see, we have all 3 trees in, they're mulched, they're gonna be watered here shortly, and they're ready to go. So we're planting them in early spring to hopefully catch any of the remaining spring rains. Hopefully we have a good year or at least a normal year for rain, which would be really nice now that these are planted. I'm really excited always to add trees because we may not enjoy the full capability and maturity of them in our lifetime, but someone will, and that to me, if you always wanna have hope for the future, plant some trees so you can have something to pass on even to someone you don't know. So what I'm gonna do is water them. We're gonna do some more work in the garden because that's what we're always doing, right? I hope you enjoy this video. I hope you like it. I hope you share it so other people can see that it can take work, it can wear you out, but we can all garden at any level, whether it's a small tree, a large tree, or whatever it is. Enjoy.